Hello and welcome to this IUN community garden session, Planning a Vegetable Garden. My name is Amanda Smith. I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Urban and Regional Excellence, and I will be today's moderator. The presenter for this session is Dolly Foster. Dolly has been a master gardener for 20 years, an Indiana accredited horticulturalist for 18 years, and a certified arborist since 2008. For the past 20 years, Dolly has been presenting lectures on many gardening topics. She spent 4 years as an adjunct faculty member of the Joliet Junior College Agriculture/Horticultural Department. And we are very glad to have you with us today, Dolly.
Thank you, Amanda. Appreciate it. Excited to be here today, everybody. So we are going to talk about a lot of different aspects of vegetable gardening today. And I didn't start vegetable gardening until probably the last 6 years. One of my roles in my last job was to plan and implement a community garden in the community where I worked. And part of that garden was going to be a pantry garden where we were going to raise vegetables, harvest the produce, and give all of it to the food pantries in town. And so the winter before we built the garden, I had to furiously learn how to vegetable garden. So since then, though, I've been vegetable gardening consistently and have picked up some really good tips and some really good methods that helped us very much in the pantry garden. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing I just want to remind everybody is that there's no mistakes in gardening. There's a lot of different ways to do different things in gardening, and you don't need to be self-conscious about, am I doing this the right way? Am I doing this the wrong way? There is a large portion of gardening that is just mostly experimentation and experience. And if you ever asked me how many plants I've killed in my gardening career over the past, 22 to 24 years, I'd say a lot. Probably hundreds and hundreds of plants have died at the hands of this horticulturist. But I've also had thousands and thousands of, plants that have succeeded. So don't be afraid to try new things. If something goes wrong in your vegetable garden this year, if this happens to be your first year or your second year, don't feel discouraged. Don't get bummed out. Don't call yourself a terrible gardener. Things happen in vegetable gardens during the year that would be different from the year before or the year after. We have different weather happenings. We have different things that happen in the soil. We have different diseases that pop up every year. So I think in short, what I just wanted to say is that if something goes wrong in your garden, you're not a bad gardener. It could be something else that's going on. So don't get down on yourself about that. So the first thing I want to talk about is deciding what you're going to plant in the garden. Make a list of what you want to grow. On the left-hand side of this slide, you can see a list of the most common vegetables that I feel like these are the most common vegetables that people have been growing in the community garden where I was working. So that includes tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers, zucchini, summer squash, winter squash. Although winter squash I don't find as popular as other types of squash. Beans, all different kinds of beans. Peas are a big one in the spring. Beets are great, and then carrots. So those are the ones that we see the most. These are the varieties of plants that we were growing the most for the pantry garden for vegetables to give away. So I consider the vegetables on the right-hand side of this slide to be the experimental vegetables, things that you might not have ever dreamed of growing, things that you might not have ever eaten, things that you've always wanted to try. And there might be something on this list that you've never even heard of. I'd never even heard of Swiss chard until about 6 years ago. Didn't know existed. Eggplant is a great one. Eggplants are very easy to grow, and I hear they're really good to cook and eat, but I don't eat them. But there's lots of different kinds of eggplants. The first year that we had the community garden, I made the mistake of growing an eggplant that was white and actually looked like an egg. And they all over ripened on the plants because my my volunteers did not know that they were ripe. They were waiting for them to turn purple. So when you are choosing your vegetables, make sure you know what they're supposed to look like at the ripe stage, so that you know when to pick them. Okra is a great one. If you're going to grow okra, you'll have to harvest okra almost every day for the time that it's fruiting. So you're going to end up with a lot of okra. So you got to do a little bit of research. What are you going to do with all this okra? You can't eat a pound of okra a day, depending on how many plants you put in. Garlic is super easy. You can order garlic. You can grow garlic from the grocery store, and that gets planted in the fall. It's a really good fall and winter crop, and then you harvest it in the next year in May and June. Asparagus is one of those rare vegetables that is a perennial, so it comes back every year, and the plants get stronger and the asparagus spears get bigger every year. So it's just one of those plants that just keeps on giving year after year after year. And you will probably see really good yield from your asparagus for about 20 years. Swiss chard is really interesting. It's a leafy green that gets cooked. You apparently do not eat it raw at all, I guess. It's one of the things that I've only ever cooked. I've never eaten it raw. Kale you can eat raw, you can eat cooked, and potatoes. Potatoes are kind of a mystery for some people. They're not really sure how to do it. So these are sort of experimental, this whole list. And if you're going to do this garden this year, pick out the things that you're going to eat the most. What is your family actually going to eat? Is it going to be tomatoes and cucumbers? Do you have a little bit of extra room? Maybe put in a couple of eggplants and just see if you like them. Don't fill an entire garden with 1 or 2 or 3 of each vegetable plant that grows in our climate, that grows in our area for the summer. Make sure that the vegetables that you are going to choose are the things that you're actually going to eat, or things that you want to try out because they're new. So the other dilemma that gardeners often have when they're first starting out is, am I supposed to grow this plant from seed, or am I supposed to grow this plant by growing a transplant in the house or outside and then planting it in the garden? So transplants are small, little tiny plants that we grow the vegetables from, and then from seed means that we're actually putting the seed in the ground in the garden, in the vegetable garden. So transplants, the ones that are on the left side in the transplants list, I really do feel like you will have better quality vegetables. You'll have vegetables a little bit quicker, and you will have more success if you plant those plants from transplants. For example, you can grow asparagus from seed. There's no problem with growing asparagus from seed, but you have to wait until the 4th year to take your first harvest. So something like asparagus, when I was getting it for the community garden, I bought plants, rootstock that was already 3 years old. So the spring after I put them in the ground was their 4th spring, and I was able to start cutting it for the pantries at that point. So the things that you can grow from seed, these are plants that grow very fast. They fruit pretty quickly, and they're very successful. And if you're growing it from transplants, one of the problems growing things like beans and cucumbers from transplants is they're kind of a vining plant, and sometimes those vines just grow really too quickly in the house. And so they get outside and they get kind of weak, and they might not make it. So it's there's always a little bit of a trade-off there for that. You might have the plants early, but you might not get the vegetables early because the plants might be a little too weak. They grow fast. They grow really well by seed. Grow them by seed. And if you've had any experience with growing any of these, opposite way, put it down in the chat and we'll discuss it at the end. I'd like to hear what you guys have experienced if you have any kind of interesting stories about that. And then after you start looking at your plants, your list, you're thinking, okay, well, I need to know more about these plants. For me, I needed to know more about beans. So I bought a book about beans. I looked up beans and all the different kinds of beans. There are hundreds of kinds of beans, people. Lots and lots of types of beans out there. And they're not all eaten fresh, and they're not all eaten dried. So one of the things I had to do was I had to get a notebook and I had to write down all the different kinds of beans just to get it into my mind, into my memory, because I was going to be teaching other people about it. And so that was my process of learning. I was receiving the following catalogs that are on the slide: Johnny's Select Seeds, High Mowing Seeds, Seed Savers Exchange, which started out saving bean seeds. Seed Savers Exchange is a fascinating organization. Baker Creek Seeds and Fedco Seeds. These are the 5 catalog houses that I was buying all of my seeds from, and their actual catalogs online and their paper catalog that you get by mail are really good resources for information about the vegetables that you're going to want to grow. So if you want to know how tall something grows, if you want to pick out new varieties, if you want to order seeds online, these are really good companies to go with. And then having a notebook to, keep some notes, that really helped me a lot. It helped me commit things to memory. One thing about these, buying things from seed and buying things from seeds from these organizations, there are seed catalogs and seed houses that sell seeds to the southern states and to the western states, the Pacific states, the Pacific Northwest states. Those catalog houses are breeding seeds, or they're buying in seeds that are bred specifically for those climates. So things like High Mowing Seeds, they're from Vermont. They grow their own vegetables and collect their own seed. And Vermont is a pretty tough winter climate. It's a short season. And so the High Mowing Seeds are good seeds for us here because they're adaptable to our climate. We have rough winters. We have kind of a short-ish season. Our season is slightly longer than Vermont. And so that's kind of a good thing to keep in mind. Where are these seeds coming from? Where have they been bred for? We don't want to grow bean seeds that are developed for growing in, say, a New Mexico summer. New Mexico is extremely hot in the summer and it's pretty dry. And we have wet, very moist, humid summers. So we want to buy seeds and get seeds that say in the description about it, what kind of climate that they are good for. They'll say, they are heat tolerant, drought tolerant, they are cold hardy, things like that. That's what you're going to want to look for. Okay, if 2022 is going to be your first season for vegetable gardening, these are just a really, really basic steps and things that you're going to need. First of all, you need to choose a spot, and your spot really does need to be in full sun. You can get away with a couple of hours of shade in the afternoon in your vegetable garden, but that's about it. So maybe between 1 and 3, you have shade. That is the peak sun and brightness for the day in the summer. But if you had a little bit of shade in your garden, it won't hurt them. Okay, you're still going to get some vegetables out of your garden. You're going to get lots of vegetables. If this is your first year, start off small. Start off with like a 4-foot by 8-foot bed. A 4-foot bed is great because you can reach across it. You can reach to the middle. 8-foot long gives you enough space to plant a couple of tomatoes, a couple of peppers, maybe a zucchini plant. So it's not a huge bed. It's not overwhelming. It's not going to supply all the vegetables for you for a year, which, by the way, you'd probably need about an acre of land to do that if you were interested in that. Make sure that you site your garden near water. So traditionally, and when I was a kid, everybody put their vegetable gardens at the back of their backyard. And as I was learning about gardening, and they were still recommending this 20 years ago, put your garden in the back, put it out of the way, your kids have to have room to play. But I would argue that the vegetable garden really needs to be as close to your back door or your patio or your deck as possible, because it needs to be close to your water and it needs to be close to your kitchen. If you have to go, if you have a very large backyard, not everybody does, but if you had a very large backyard, if you had to walk all the way to your, backyard that's a half a football field long, just speaking hypothetically, then you might not be excited about going out and picking your vegetables every day. And if your vegetables are at the foot of your deck or behind your patio or on the side of your house by your back door, then you will go out to your garden every day. You will weed your garden more, you will fertilize your garden more often, and you will gather your vegetables more often. So you will have much better results for your garden, and you will feel better as a gardener by doing that. Okay, build in the sun, add compost to your plot. If you are going with raised beds, your raised beds should have 60% compost, 40% black soil. Okay, and the reason for that is that if you fill up a 4-foot by 8-foot bed with all black soil, topsoil, or pulverized soil, that soil has a tendency to really, as it's being watered over the year, it's going to compact and it's going to get very, very hard when it's dry. And that is going to be a big problem for your plants. So adding compost and having mostly compost in there keeps the soil light, keeps it fluffy, gives you good drainage. We're going to talk about drainage in a little bit. It's extremely important to have good drainage in your garden. You don't want water sitting on the top, drowning your plants. Weed your garden regularly. I usually tell my community garden volunteers that I need someone out there getting those gardens weeded once a week. You don't need to do it once a week. It depends on what weeds pop up. Most likely, if this is a brand new bed, brand new compost, brand new soil, you probably won't have any weeds for the first year. I say probably, but I don't promise that. I can't promise that. And then water properly. And we're going to talk about watering in a little bit. So basic tools for a vegetable garden. You don't need very many very specialized tools. Your basic things that you're going to need is a round tipped shovel, which is sort of a pointed top shovel, a garden fork, also called a potato fork. You're going to need a little trowel. It helps you plant seeds. Hand pruners, because we're going to talk about pruning vegetable plants in a little bit. So you need some cutters. A harvest knife is always very, very handy. There's a lot of vegetables, including things like eggplant and some squash, sometimes peppers. You can't always just pull that plant from you can't pull the vegetables from the plant. You must cut them, otherwise you're going to damage the plant. They have a really big stem. They have a really strong stem. A bow rake is very handy, and so is a hoe. Even a small hoe, if this is going to be a small raised garden, you can find small hoes that are on a short handle that are really good, that you can sit next to your bed and fluff your soil up a little bit. So if this garden of yours is going to be put in the ground, if that's where you're going to put this garden, have a soil test done before you plant. So that would mean that you'd want to get out there and do that now. A soil test takes a couple of weeks to get back to you. And what they're going to do is tell you what kind of nutrients you have in your soil and what kind of nutrients your soil needs. You can call the extension office in Crown Point or LaPorte County or Porter County, wherever you're at. If you're out of state, your county has an extension office, and you just need to Google whatever state you're in or whatever county you're in that state and Google extension office, and it will pop up. The extension office will have information about how to go about getting us a proper soil test. Okay. The pH of your soil is pretty important to know, so it's a good thing to do. Choices of seeds and plants. So back to seeds. There are a few different varieties. I don't want to say varieties. I want to say categories. There's 3 different categories of seeds that you can buy. You can buy organic seeds, which were seeds that came from vegetables that were raised organically. You can order hybrid seeds, which are seeds of plants that were hybridized 1 generation back. So the fruit of that plant is not something that you should save the seed from. And then heirloom, which are open pollinated, really, really old varieties of tomatoes and peppers and beans and things like that. Heirloom vegetables, if you go with those, they have great flavor, they have heritage to them, they're very old, and their seeds can be saved. So that would be the difference between those. And then what do I have next? So organic, I don't exactly require that I order organic seeds all the time. Some people are very, very vigilant about that. I'm not as vigilant about that. What I was more concerned with when I first started vegetable gardening was, do I want to go hybrid or heirloom? And you can get hybrid organic seeds, and you can also find heirloom organic seeds. So you just got to make sure that you know those keywords and that you're looking for them in the catalogs. So what I really wanted and what I suggested to the people who were renting plots in the community garden who I was teaching, I told them, you know, go with the hybrids for the first year. Maybe go with hybrids for the second year. But then if you really, really want to get into organic seeds, and you can organic garden with regular hybrid seeds. You can still organic garden. There's no reason not to. What I'm trying to say is that hybrids are sometimes a little bit more prone to disease, and sometimes they have some special needs, pretty slight differences, not very big differences. But sometimes those plants are a little bit trickier. They definitely taste better, especially the tomatoes. They taste really good. So maybe start out with the hybrid stuff that is really tried and true. Even though they're new varieties, they've been tested, they're hardy, they're disease resistant, so that you don't have to worry about those things your first couple of years gardening. And then after that, start getting into the heirloom varieties, and then you can start saving your own seeds. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about planning. So planning the layout of your garden. So these are just a few instances of things that you need to think about when planning the garden. So we're not going to go through every plant. But there are some plants that are kind of fussy that absolutely need more sun than any other plants. And those are definitely tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and herbs, including basil. They need to have full sun all the time. So I was talking about how you can put your garden in part shade. So these would be the plants that you would want to make sure were in the full sun all day long, whereas other plants can take a little bit of shade at the end of the day. Okay, these are your highest value crops in your garden. These are the things that are going to feed you the most in the garden, including also probably cucumber. Those are going to be your highest value. So make sure they are treated like kings in the garden, basically. There are plants that roam in the garden. So these would be things like zucchini, squash, and melons. They really do roam. Very large zucchini plants. There are bush zucchini plants out there that you can grow that stay very compact, and they're okay to grow. Why not? Do it if you have to save the space. But sometimes you want to try a special variety of zucchini or squash or melon, watermelon, cantaloupe, anything like that. Sometimes you want to try a special variety, so you have to put up with the 20 and 30 foot long vines. So these are plants that roam around the garden, so you have to be prepared for that. We always had we had a great volunteer that mowed the lawn for us at the garden, and he would have to move the zucchini vines, and then he'd move them back and he'd mow under them, and it was quite a process for him around those beds, but he was very diligent and he was very careful. And so that's what you need to just keep in mind, that these plants will spill out of your beds. So be prepared for that. They're going to spill out. Don't cut them. This is one thing that you do not ever want to cut, because the flowers and the fruit are going to be along the whole vine, not just towards the base of the plant. All right, growing vertical for many, many different crops saves a whole lot of space. It's a great way to save space. And so some of the things that we have grown vertically in the community garden were cucumbers, which is not something traditionally you grow vertically, but boy, does it save space and you get more cucumbers. Pole beans, of course, we grew those on arches. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a minute. Small squash, small cantaloupes, like mini cantaloupes, mini watermelons, peas can be grown on trellises. I think that's about all that we have ever grown on trellises. Now, if you want to grow squash on there, it has to be a small squash, like a summer squash, something, or a mini zucchini or something like that. The really, really big ones, the big zucchinis that are sometimes called mallows, those need to be on the ground because they are much, much too heavy. And if you put pumpkins on a trellis, and I'm speaking from experience, if you put small pumpkins on a trellis, they are most likely going to get ripped off. I'm just saying. That was the only instance of vandalism that we had in our garden the first year, was my pumpkins got stolen because I had them up on a trellis and I should have known better. They, once they turned orange, they were just kind of a target. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we did. Oh, I guess I have those. I have those pictures a little bit later, and I'm going to show you those. So succession planting is another way to lay out your garden. This is a great way of getting more out of your plot. So this is planting things together, planting things in sequence. So what we used to do was, since we had our green beans on trellises, we had them on arches that went over our pathways. That left the rest of that 8-foot bed clear so that we could put something else in with it. So one bed we would put all the carrots, one bed we would put beets, and we would do beets twice a season. So we'd get two crops of beets, and then cabbage was paired with them. Lettuce was paired with the beans. You can put things, we did kale and collards and chard with the beans, and cucumbers can also be put with the beans if they're bush cucumbers. Otherwise, you want to put cucumbers on their own trellis. Don't mix them with the beans, because then it kind of makes it hard to find the fruit. So these are, and radishes, beets, scallions are varieties of vegetables that you can plant early enough in the spring. If you did plant the seeds out in the garden early enough in the spring, say the second week of April or so, that means towards June, then you would be able to gather up all that vegetable to eat, and then amend that soil a little bit, and then start over again and have a whole nother crop for fall. So it's really cool because they're very, very short season varieties. All right, pictures are coming up. So intercropping is a little bit interesting. Intercropping sort of follows the rules of companion planting. And this is planting 2 crops in a space to confuse pests. And so we plant things like tomatoes and borage with tomatoes, basil, and borage together because they ward off pests. And basil is, pretty traditionally planted with tomatoes because people believe it makes their tomatoes sweeter. I'm not sure if that's really true. I'm not sure if anybody knows if that's true, but it is kind of a traditional thing. But definitely if you put the herb borage in with your tomatoes, you will keep tomato hornworms away from your tomatoes. They don't like how they smell. Cucumbers and sunflowers are really useful to grow together because as the sunflowers grow, the cucumber vines can climb the sunflowers. If it's a really big, strong sunflower stem, not one of the little ones. Broccoli and beets can be planted really easily together because you can plant a couple of rows of broccoli in a 4-foot by 8-foot bed. I think we used to put 3 rows in there, and then the beets in between. And by the time the broccoli was getting big enough to start forming their heads, the beets were ready to harvest at sort of a smallish size so that we weren't disturbing the broccoli roots. And then you could put in broccoli on the edges of or beets on the edges of the bed when you take out beets. But if you do the beets first, then you can do a row down the middle. So that's intercropping for that. Carrots and beans can be planted together, like I mentioned before. Potatoes and lettuce are an interesting pair. If you plant the potatoes early in April, you can also lay down a row of lettuce leaves, lettuce seeds in between the rows of potatoes. And then as the lettuce is getting ready to harvest, then the potatoes are also starting to grow big enough to shade the lettuce. So you might be able to get lettuce for a couple of weeks longer because those potato leaves are going to shade it and keep it cool, because lettuce is well known to be a cool season crop and doesn't like a lot of severe heat. It tends to wilt and die back in 80 to 90 degree temperatures. Pole beans and cabbage are really good friends. you know, if you put an arch up or a big panel of cattle panel and you grow all your beans on that, then the cabbage can just be laying on the ground because the beans are going to go straight up and that leaves the rest of the bed available. And so here's a picture of what this looks like. This was a few years ago. These are the beds at the pantry garden. These aren't the beds that people were renting. So we eventually, 2 years ago, we put in 3 more trellises. So we have 5 bean trellises now, and we just get loads and loads of beans off of them. They really like climbing, and it's very easy to stand under the arches and gather up all the beans. Some of our volunteers were kind of short, so they were never put on bean duty because they couldn't reach the top ones. So these trellises were very, very simple to put up. This is a 20-foot cattle panel. We cut a few feet off of it and we simply folded it in half and tried not to put a crease in it, but we folded it in half, and one person would hold the trellis in between the beds, and then we would have these 4 poles already in the ground, and we would simply tie them on with heavy twine or very, very heavy zip ties. And the 2 trellises that we put in first, we haven't had to change those zip ties yet. They last a long time if they're the heavy duty ones. And then that's it. If we needed to take them down and plant something else there, we could. It's really fun in the summer to walk down them. It's real cool underneath them. And last summer I did do something special. Like on one of the trellises, I grew birdhouse gourds, and we got a lot of birdhouse gourds off of those vines. But it was just more of a curiosity thing, kind of a fun thing to see if we could grow it and get any of the fruit. All right, so a couple more tips for laying out your garden. Don't overcrowd your beds. And there is something to be said for planting your garden somewhere between the recommended spacing on a seed package and overcrowding, if that makes sense. So somewhere in between those 2 things is the right way to plant. I tend to put all of my flower plants really, really close together. So I had a really bad tendency of doing this also with the vegetables. So some of our more experienced gardeners had taught me, well, they need to be spaced out a little bit farther because vegetable plants do need some air circulation in between them to prevent diseases. Now, if your bean plant says, you know, plant 2 seeds every, 2 feet, actually you can plant your bean seeds along the base of your trellis, 2 bean seeds every 10 inches. And so that way you get more vines, you get more fruit. Plants compete for resources, so overcrowding can really deplete your soil. So that's where putting in new compost every year and making sure that you fertilize your garden with an organic fertilizer every couple of weeks during the summer really helps. And then square foot gardening really helps. So this is a chart. This is a really nice chart for square foot gardening. And if you want more information about square foot gardening, there is a book called Square Foot Gardening. And the man who wrote the book wrote it, I want to say 20 or 30 years ago. I think like 30 years ago. And it's still a really popular way to plant a vegetable garden. There were several people who rented plots at our community garden that did it. And they would put nails in their bed because the beds were wood, and then tie the string across and make squares. And so there's your square foot. And then if we go back to this, we can see that in 1 square foot, we can put 1 tomato plant and we can put 1 pepper plant. But if we wanted to grow onions, we could definitely put 9 in there. Head lettuce, we can put 4 in there in a square foot. Cucumbers, we can put 2 cucumbers in there if they're bush cucumbers in a square foot, and so on and so forth. Things like the herbs, sometimes the herbs get a little bit big and they spread, especially oregano and thyme. So keep your eye on those. Sage can also get very large, but also you should be gathering those herbs. You should be maybe drying them or putting them into you can freeze dry them, or you can put them into a dehydrator. That's really the proper way to preserve herbs, is in a small dehydrator that fits on your kitchen counter. But I'm sure you get the idea. So again, square foot gardening is not going to provide you with all the vegetables for the whole summer or by any stretch of the imagination. But this is a good way to divide up a small piece of property, a small-ish bed, or even a large one, in such a way that you can have a big variety. And square foot gardening doesn't mean that if you're going to do this in your bed, it has to look like this. It doesn't have to look like this. You can do square foot gardening, and you can do what this gardener did was they put a whole row of peppers there on the right, and then a whole row of onions, and then I think that's another pepper plant next to the onions. And so it doesn't have to just be 1 square foot of whatever the vegetable is. It can be multiple square feet of the vegetable that you want to grow. So I don't want you to think that it has to look like the chart. It can be anything you want it to be. Remember, when you see seeds and or plants at the garden center that say, I am a mini pepper or I am a mini tomato, unless it says it's a patio plant, that mini pepper or mini tomato plant, cherry tomato plant, whatever it says, if it says it's small fruit, it's going to come from a regular size plant. So be prepared for that. There are plants out there called patio tomatoes, and there's patio blueberries and patio of other things. My experience with the patio tomatoes is that they have not been the most juicy and tasty tomatoes in the world. So maybe go with something else. They're not the greatest tasting. All right, so let's talk about watering in the garden. Watering is so important. First of all, if you feel like you might be going on vacation this summer, definitely get a garden sitter that is going to be able to take care of your garden, especially if you're going to do something like go away in July or August, because in July and August, your garden is going to need to be watered almost every single day. And this person should be someone who knows how to do this. And it's going to become evident as we go down the list here. So well-drained soil is probably one of the most important parts of watering a garden, like a vegetable garden. You want well-drained soil because that is going to make your plants the happiest. Vegetable plants do not like to sit in water. There's no vegetable plant that I know that likes really moist soil. If you know of one, put it down in the chat. You can educate me today. And just well-drained aerated soil is going to be very important. You just don't want your plants sitting in water. So add compost, or you can add straight perlite, which is a soil amendment to your soil. You can, if you have a vegetable bed right now that is all topsoil and you think you've been having some problems with compaction and you're not happy with how your vegetables have come out in that soil because it was pulverized topsoil possibly, you know, this year then add some compost, add some chicken manure. You can buy rabbit manure sometimes at like Tractor Supply and places like that. Add some kind of nutrient to your soil. And then you can also add a couple of bags of potting soil over the top too, which wouldn't hurt your plants. So compost should be added annually. And if you're going to have a very large garden, very large rows, long rows, a really good way to add compost to your garden is by adding aged cow and aged horse manure in the fall. So keep that in mind. If you're growing in the ground and you're worried about drainage in your long rows, then hill the soil up. So dig the soil out along the long rows that you're going to plant in, and hill it up on itself, okay? And make a mound, a long mound. And then that will help your plants drain well. Hand water very carefully. So this is the most important thing. So like if you're going to have a garden center, make sure this person knows how to hand water. You do not want someone just to put a sprinkler, and you should never just put a sprinkler on the vegetable garden. And the reason is that a lot of vegetable plants are susceptible to fungal diseases on their leaves, and that fungal disease can spread onto the fruit, and it makes the fruit inedible. And then the fungal disease stays in the soil from winter to winter to winter, and then blossoms in the summer on your plants. So to minimize that, keep the leaves of your vegetable plants as dry as possible when you are hand watering. We cannot control Mother Nature. We cannot control rain. I do not expect you to go outside with towels and dry your plants off after a rainstorm. That is impractical. However, you can control how you hand water to best keep your plants as healthy as possible. So that means directly watering around the base of the plant gently with a shower head type of nozzle on your hose. That doesn't mean spray the water under your plants in such a manner that you are going to push soil off of the roots of your plants. Make sure that it's very gentle, and make sure that it is frequent during hot summer weather, very hot summer weather. So keep the water off of the plant stems, keep the water off of the leaves, water under the leaves. Once we started doing that in our community garden, we really saw a difference in how things like our squash looked. There was one summer and fall where we actually, it was warm enough, so we actually were harvesting squash and zucchini well into October because the plants were so healthy. And in years past, we had to take those plants out of the ground in the middle of September, sometimes the beginning of September, because the plants had powdery mildew and they just looked really bad and they weren't flowering anymore. So that's just a really good example of the healthier your plants are, the better they are going to perform and the longer they can perform. But then again, once you get to October, you might be sick and tired of vegetable gardening and you might be happy to put the garden to bed, and that's okay too. All right, so most plants can be supported vertically, and most plants that grow vertically can be supported and they should be supported. So this is a photograph of our pepper plants. And when I had the volunteers plant our peppers, we always put a piece of bamboo in with them and kind of tied them to it so the wind wouldn't snap them. But we put the twine on just loose enough so that the plants could wiggle a little bit with the wind, which does create a nice strong stem. And when we did do this, we had better plants at the end of the season. We had stronger stems. We didn't have plants that were falling over. What else do I have here for you? So supporting plants vertically secures them and keeps the wind from breaking them, but prevents disease by allowing airflow. So when we would do the planting of the peppers like this, then I would go through and take off the bottom leaves to create air circulation around the base of the plants. And then when we would plant tomatoes, we would allow the tomatoes to grow for a little bit and let the vines grow for a little bit, probably about 2 or 3 weeks. And then we would train them up the cattle panel in the middle of the bed. We would secure them with these little white plastic clips called tomato clips. They were really very useful. They saved time because we had 95 tomato plants to trellis. And I'm not even joking that. I think we had 9 beds, and we had more than 9 beds with 8 plants. There's 8 plants in this bed. Yeah, we had almost 100 tomato plants to trellis every year. So once we would spend time, if you're doing this with volunteers and you're doing this where you have to get a group of people together, get a group of people together and teach them how to do it on one bed and then let them loose on the other beds and they can take care of the rest. But we would train the tomato plants up the trellis, clip them on, and then we would strip all of the leaves off of the base of that plant for 12 to 18 inches. And this creates that air circulation that helps prevent tomato blight. Late blight is one of the worst things that can happen to your tomatoes in your vegetable garden. It will shorten the amount of time that you can gather tomatoes for the season. And it will, if it gets onto your fruit, it makes the fruit inedible. We could not give that fruit that had the black spots on it. They're very, very tiny black spots, but we could not give that to the pantries. Our idea of giving vegetables to the pantries in our area was we were giving them the highest quality vegetables and the most beautiful organic vegetables as we could. This was not leftovers. This was not bruised fruit. This was not the dregs of the flower beds. This was top quality, like Whole Foods quality vegetables. And I want the same for your home gardens. So doing things like creating good air circulation for your tomato plants is really important. And the same thing for cucumbers. This is another way. This is actually the exact same kind of trellising. and you get the cucumbers up there. Now for cucumbers, they don't climb really well on their own, so you got to give them a little bit of help. So my job when I would go to the garden with my crew would water, and my job was to train the cucumber vine up the trellis. And I would do that once a week, and they would climb up to the top, which was 4 feet. And then they would flower and vine. And we did remove some of the foliage. There was one year where we did a really big removal of foliage just to see how well it would work with the cucumbers to try and prevent powdery mildew. And then it did not work well. They did not fruit well. We did not get a lot of cucumbers that year. And then the next year we just took off a little bit of the foliage so that the bees could see the flowers. That's one reason to take off a little bit of your cucumber foliage. And then also to minimize that powdery mildew. And that it worked better with taking off just a few. I just want to show you one photo of a very, very cool thing that one of the neighbors near the garden does every year. And I worked there for 15 years. And this person had been doing this for decades before that. So what they did was, this house is, 1960s, probably mid 60s or late 60s. And when the house was built, there was a large landscape bed that was built around the house. It was very cool. And so this person probably grew pickles. I'm pretty sure that those are cucumber vines. And they have hooks up under the soffit, and they would run string, and then they would plant their cucumber seeds. And then they can climb the string pretty easily, but I never found that they climbed my trellises very well. But then after they were done making their pickles or whatever they did with all their cucumbers, the whole thing was all cleaned up by the end of August. It was really neat. And I never, ever saw, at 15 summers I was at that place, I never saw the gardener once. And I always wanted to see that gardener and just talk to them about what they were growing. And I never got the opportunity, but I wish I had. So this is just kind of an interesting idea. Just something fun that the neighbors do. So this is what our community garden looked like when we had more trellises put in for the beans, and you can see the beans growing up the side. And you can see in one bed over on the right, we have chard with our beans, we have kale with our beans. On the other side, we had beets, and we had some squash with our beans. And so each bed had something different in it that was accompanying the beans. And like I said, we got lots of beans doing it that way. So I want to talk about pruning vegetables. Pruning vegetable plants isn't something that a lot of gardeners really think about, but it is. So it's sort of a new concept and sort of not a new concept. But again, this is something that creates air circulation in the garden bed and will help fight fungal diseases, and it keeps the foliage drier after rainstorms. Air can get in there and dry things off faster. And these are the 4 plants that have probably the worst problems with powdery mildew and late blight. And peppers, not as much, but I find that if I do trim my pepper plants a little bit, the bees can find the flowers easier. So that would be a reason why you would want to prune them. So this is one of our renters at the community garden, my friend George. And George did this to his tomatoes every year, and he had masses of tomatoes. So this is probably a little bit excessive. I don't know if I would quite take that many leaves off of my tomato plants, but this is just an example of one of the things that you can do. And one of the things that I noticed with this was that he never had any problems with his tomato cages falling over. And the reason why I went to the cattle panel method for the tomatoes on the pantry garden side was because we would use tomato cages, and tomato cages aren't for tomatoes that grow the entire year. There's 2 different types of tomatoes. One type of tomato is indeterminate, continues to grow to frost and fruit. And then determinate tomatoes grow to a certain height, and then they put all their fruit on at one time. So if you make sauce, it's a great way to do tomato sauce because all your fruit is ready at the same time. So tomato cages are really built for those tomatoes. But if you put indeterminate old heirloom varieties that can grow, 7 feet, if you really, really had the chance to trellis them, they would probably grow 7 feet. Our tomato plants in the tomato cages would fall over by the end of September. So George never had this problem because there was not that much weight of all the foliage on his tomato cages. Another reason why to trim. You might, trimming this much of your tomato plant might scare the crap out of you right now, but they will still fruit. And any tomato that is exposed to the sun while it's ripening is going to taste better because it will have more sugars in it. It will produce more sugars. So that's another thing to think about. You don't want them hidden under the foliage. So tips for a great garden. Let's talk about beating pests. This is probably a big thing that people want to grow their vegetables organically. And then they're like, oh no, what about all the pests that are going to come to my garden? For your very first year of vegetable gardening, you most likely won't have very many pests or a big variety of them. It took about 2 years for the pests to find our pantry garden. And that's the only vegetable gardening I've ever done. So this is why I'm only talking about this. I don't have room for gardening at home, vegetable gardening, that is. So when you are thinking about beating the pests in your vegetable garden, you want to plant for the 3 Ps. You want to plant some extra plants for pollinators. You want to plant plants that are going to attract predators that are going to eat your pests. And then you also want to attract parasite insects that are also going to attack your pests. So I'm going to talk about several different plants that are going to help you in this endeavor. So beneficial insects are going to reproduce in your garden if they have plants in your garden that will provide them with food when your pest is not there. So very, very small parasitic wasps that help you get rid of other pests like tomato hornworm. They also need high volumes of really high quality pollen to eat when there's not a tomato hornworm there. They will hang out in your garden, they'll live in your garden, and then when they find a tomato hornworm, they will lay their eggs on it. So they are reproducing in your garden. So that's a good thing. So if you ever see a big caterpillar on a tomato plant that has a lot of little white bumps on it, little white, kind of like little white pods, they almost look like a giant piece of rice, leave that tomato hornworm. That tomato hornworm isn't going to do very much damage for the amount of time it's going to be on your plant because it's slowing down and it's weakening and it's weakening and it's weakening. And then the parasitic wasp will be able to hatch from there. So we want to keep those around. That's about the little pest, the little parasitic wasp is a beneficial insect. So we can call our gardens another word when we're also planting for insects, and that is called an insectary. And so if you would like to really delve into this and learn about growing your garden, your flower garden at home and your landscape at home, you can look for tips on growing for pollinators and growing an insectiary. And your handout is going to have all of this text on it. So you'll have the spelling of insectiary on there. So insectiary plants are grown to attract, feed, and shelter beneficial insects. And that means that your beneficial insects are going to control the pests. So if you garden conventionally using pesticides, what happens is that you not only kill your pest insects, you also damage your beneficial insects. And that's what we don't want to do anymore. All right, so some things to learn about beneficial insects is that hunting for insects to eat consumes a lot of energy, and this is why beneficial insects need lots and lots of high quality pollen that will also give them energy. So some of these plants are, well, one of these plants are marigolds. So one of the reasons why gardeners have been planting marigolds in their garden for probably the last 120 years is because it is said that marigolds will drive off and keep nematodes, harmful nematodes out of your garden. Well, that is true for really, really old-fashioned types of marigolds that have a lot of the scent in marigolds. That chemical is very, very potent in the older varieties, the heirloom varieties of marigolds. And so that's what this little photograph is. It's one of the heirloom varieties called Lemon Gem. And the Gem series has been around for a very, very long time. They're considered heirloom. I don't find it very easy to gather seeds from that plant for some reason. They don't always germinate very well, but when I buy seeds for this plant, they grow well. And Some other beneficial insect plants are going to be alliums. Alyssum is a great one. Yarrow is good. Fennel is great. Asters are really good for the end of the season, and so is goldenrod. Okay. If you need clarification about that, let me know in the chat. So here's just a couple more pictures of this marigold. This marigold is called Tagetes tenuifolia. And again, the variety is the gem series. So we have red gem, lemon gem is the yellow, and then orange gem, and then there's kind of a mix. And the flowers are all about the size of a dime. And what they do is they feed all of the really, really tiny beneficial insects that you don't even notice. There's hundreds of varieties of beneficial bees and wasps that are in Indiana and Illinois. There's about 400 species of them, and some of them are just so tiny you never notice them. They don't have stingers. They lay their eggs in the ground, or they'll have a nest in the ground, or they nest in a stem of a plant. And you just never really notice the job that they're doing. But if you provide the flowers for them, they will come to your garden and do that job. So then there's a whole class of plants that repel insects. So we have things like Nasturtium is great. Nasturtium is a trap crop. And so it will attract when you have, I think it's potato, four-line to potato bug. Let's see. Nasturtium's a trap crop for aphids and cucumber beetles. That's what I was trying to think of. Whiteflies and squash bugs. So if these insects show up in your vegetable garden, they will be attracted to the nasturtium plant. Another beneficial thing about the nasturtium plant is if you don't see insects on it, you can eat all parts of your plant. You can eat the flowers and the leaves. You can throw them in salad. They taste very peppery. They're very good. So the next plant that we have on the list here is basil, and there's lots of different varieties of basil. In this photo, we see green basil, which is the Italian sweet basil, and then a purple basil next to it. Basil is great because it repels aphids and flies, mosquitoes, and it controls tomato hornworms, meaning it just kind of keeps the tomato hornworms from laying their eggs on the tomato plants. Down below that, we have cilantro. Cilantro drives off a lot of different insects. I think aphids are one of them. I don't have it on here for some reason, but cilantro is really good because it, thinking about what plants are there to repel insects, think about plants that smell a lot. So basil has a really potent smell. Cilantro has a potent smell. Nasturtium sort of has a potent smell to us, but it's more potent to the insects. And then borage has a potent smell. It smells sort of like cucumbers. And borage will repel tomato hornworms. So this is a great plant to not only put in with your tomatoes because it sort of drives off tomato hornworms, but it attracts bumblebees. And bumblebees are the main pollinator of tomato plants. And they pollinate your tomato plants by using buzz pollination. So they get in there to collect the nectar and the pollen from your tomato flowers, and they wiggle their bodies so fast that it vibrates the whole flower, and they get covered with tomato pollen, and then they go to the next flower and they pollinate that flower. And so that's called buzz pollination. The next class of plants here for repelling insects is alliums. Alliums are the onion family. And the onion family of plants has a really big variety, and some of them are very attractive. So this is just a little flavor. In the center here, we have regular chives. And chives is a great plant, but chives can sometimes grow a little bit too fast, and it gets a little bit too much like a thug in the garden. And then a good substitute for it, though, and you can still eat it, is the one below it, which is native nodding wild onion. So you can eat the foliage on nodding wild onion, just like chives. You don't have the flowers that you can also eat, but it doesn't spread as fast. So some people don't like chives because they spread too fast. That's my point. Next to this over here on the right-hand side, those tall purple balls, that is Globemaster Allium. So it's a very large allium that blooms in the spring. So the leaves for that plant are starting to come up in my garden. I have lots and lots of these allium. And when I started planting these allium in my garden, I stopped having squirrels digging in my garden. So this is one reason why these are good to put into your landscaping, into your flower beds. In your vegetable beds, though, on the corners of your vegetable beds, you can put things in like the nodding wild onion. You can plant garlic, which is down on the lower left. On the upper left is a bunching ornamental onion, which sort of looks and feels and acts like chives, but they're not edible. However, they do attract a lot of bees and they do keep a lot of pests away. All right. So, and they bloom in the summer, so they attract a lot of bees. And then the one down on the bottom right-hand side, just for fun, is called Egyptian walking onion, which is an edible onion. And instead of a flower stem, this onion sends up a big stem, and then it gets these little bulblets on the end. And these little bulblets can be taken off, and they can be peeled just like garlic, and they can be used in recipes. All right, and then you will want to attract bees to your vegetable garden. It's impractical to think that you are not going to have any bees in your vegetable garden because you need them. The only way that we have the food that we eat in grocery stores and on the shelves and in the vegetable areas and the fruit area is because of bees. And so this is a whole list of plants, and this list of plants is in your handout when you get it. These are all the best plants for bees that I could think of, that I've seen on other lists, that I've had experience with. And so you don't have to have all of these, but if you have any of these on your property or near your vegetable garden, it will improve your chances of having a good bee population. And then just a couple more tips for beating leaf diseases. Periodically, when you are weeding your garden, also take yellow leaves off of your vegetable plants, and especially ones that are touching the ground. So make sure that you have good sanitation in your vegetable gardens. Keep them neat and tidy. Don't let foliage sit on the ground. When it rots, it creates diseases. You can have botrytis blight show up and other things. And then you can also prevent leaf diseases by mulching your beds. You can mulch with wood mulch, you can mulch with straw. You can mulch, I've seen people mulch their tomato plants with layers of newspaper, like 4 or 5 layers of newspaper, and then about an inch of sand over it. And it works really, really well. And as far as I know, I've only seen that around tomato plants, but you have to look into it and see if people are doing it for any other their vegetables. So let's see. Just a couple of shots from my garden from years past. You can see beyond this flower bed, you can see some tall plants behind it. That was our large pollinator gardens that we had in the middle of our community garden. And I felt that it was important to have the pollinator gardens there to attract the pollinators that we needed. This was a this was cucumber bed. And you can see the trellis on the back of the bed. They hadn't gotten tall enough for me to start training them yet, but they were close. So you can start seeds indoors in your house if you have room, if you have a sunny window. Now is the time to start things like peppers and tomatoes. Other vegetables, you can probably wait just a little bit longer. And then you can also start seeds by winter sowing. And that's what this photo is. This is winter sowing. It's not too late to winter sow annual flowers and vegetables. And you can look on the IUN Cure YouTube channel, and I have a class there for winter sowing if you want to learn more about that. So I'm not going to go into it very in depth here, but it is really good way to germinate plants. One of the best reasons why I got into, well, 2 reasons why I got into winter sowing was because I didn't have room in my house to grow seeds for flowers. And then the other reason why I got into it was because the plants are automatically hardened off and you don't have to take them in and out, in and out, in and out. If you know what that's all about, you know how much of a pain in the butt it is. So let's review a few things. What to grow this season. Really honestly think about what your family is going to eat. Don't grow things that your family doesn't need and then drop them off on your neighbor's doorsteps. I've gotten zucchinis that way. And do you want to plant anything new? Are you interested in trying any of those plants on that experiment list? Draw up your plan. You can just use paper and pencil. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be a computer program or anything. Place the plants well. Use the seed catalogs and the information on the seed catalogs online as a guide to help you space things out. And then, put it a little slightly tighter, fit in 1 or 2 extra plants. That way you're getting the maximum amount of your space. Use square foot gardening. That's another good way to do this. Start out small. So if you want to start really getting into vegetable gardening, you're really making this as a lifestyle choice. You're going to go organic. Maybe you want to go and start a vegan lifestyle or vegetarian lifestyle. So you're going to have to grow a lot yourself. Start out small this year. Be honest with yourself. If you're new to gardening, don't overwhelm yourself. Just have 1 or 2 beds and make sure it's what you can take care of. Never plant more than what you think you can take care of. Some good gardening practices, make sure to look into supporting plants vertically because it gives them good air circulation. It gets them up high near the sun and then makes room for you to plant underneath them. Prune your vegetable plants. Make room for the sun to get to your tomatoes. Try and prevent blight. Some gardeners are very meticulous about preventing blight and they've never had it in their garden and they've had vegetable gardens for years because they're really meticulous about sanitation and pruning and keeping things tidy. Water carefully. Remember, don't water your leaves of your plants, but don't worry about the rain. And then tips to make a really great garden, start to create an insectiary, whether that is in your landscaping, in your flower gardens, or in your vegetable garden. Really think about what kind of beneficial insects can you attract and what plants you need to attract them. And there's lots of information online about that. And then decide to plant to repel insects, repel those undesirable insects. Basil is by far, basil and lemongrass are the 2 plants by far that do better job at repelling mosquitoes in your yard than any citronella plant will ever do. So I have pots of basil all over my yard. I have lemongrass every year. I usually grow about 6 big pots of lemongrass. And those are just 2 plants. Lemongrass should have been on that list. I'll have to change this and put it on. But those are 2 plants that are really great to just for that one undesirable insect that we all really don't like. And then make a plan for next season. Really pay attention this season. How did things go for you? What was your experience like? Are you happy with vegetable gardening? Do you really want to do it next year? Really keep an eye on your plants. How many tomato plants did you plant? How many plants were successful? Maybe get a scale. Maybe keep track of how many pounds of vegetables you're getting out of your garden. Sometimes that can be really eye-opening to gardeners. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I could get 20 pounds of eggplant off of 1 plant. That it's really eye-opening. Like, okay, well, what does that mean in how many meals is that for me? Some gardeners do stuff like that. Okay, so just a few more photos. This is what a really high summer harvest for the food pantries would be. In fact, this could be a photo. This could be the photo from last summer of our largest harvest ever. But I kind of don't think it is. I think this is from 2 years ago. I think this was our largest harvest 2 years ago. So you can see the variety of vegetables that we planted. We always included hot peppers. We had a couple, we had poblanos and we had jalapenos, just simple hot peppers. And then lots of sweet peppers and some long roasting peppers. So I liked to make sure that we had a variety of vegetables that we knew that people liked. And it made me happy when the food pantries said that they really liked our vegetables. So that made me happy. All right, this is the garden. This is part of the garden. There's more beds behind me, including a 16-foot long zucchini bed. This was just a week or 2 after our planting date in May. This was, let's see, there's only 2 arches up. This was 3 years ago. And this is the garden when it's in full bloom. Right down in front is a 16-foot long zucchini bed. I had to build that 16-foot long zucchini bed because according to my garden partner, Larry, we were not getting enough zucchini and we needed more zucchini. So I had to put in another bed for zucchini. Another shot of the garden from 2 years ago. You can see that we put in marigolds just in the corners of the beds. We just let them spill over the sides. And that was it. If you have any questions, let's get the chat going.
So the first one is, did you find that your bean trellis shaded out the bed behind it?
No, because our beds were on an east-west configuration. So they may have gotten, the beds on the left would have gotten a little bit of shade in the afternoon, and the beds on the right got a little bit of shade in the afternoon. It's the opposite. Yeah, they would get a little bit of shade, but it never affected what was in the beds. The kale plants that were closest to the bean plants still got as tall as the other kale plants, for example.
For perennial herbs like thyme and sage, what should you do for them in the spring?
Cut them back, give them a haircut, especially the sage, because it can get quite large. And theoretically, you would have collected all the leaves that you wanted to preserve over the winter if you wanted to. And so there's going to be a lot of bare stems anyway, and they're going to put out a whole bunch of new stems. So because sage is a perennial, treated just like a perennial sage, just like one of the ornamental ones, you would cut it back almost to the ground. But for the big garden sage, the herb sage, I would say, leave some stems, cut it back, keep it tidy, keep it tight, leave some stems, don't cut it to the ground. And then the thyme, just give it a quick haircut. Don't cut it really, really far down.
Great, thank you, Dolly. What is the best compost, and does it matter what compost you use?
I don't think that there is a best compost. I think that there's a few different composts that do good things, and then all compost does one good thing. The one thing that all compost does is that it lightens up your soil, aerates it, and helps with drainage. Some composts are going to be more nutrient dense, like horse manure and cow manure. So if you do happen to have, if you have a raised bed, you have a lot of pulverized soil in it, you haven't been fertilizing your vegetables a lot in the past couple of years, then it might be the year to buy some bagged cow manure. And the bagged cow manure is composted. So you can, and it looks like soil. You can just add it right into your bed. So yeah, I don't think there's just one best one. I know a lot of people swear on chicken manure for their vegetable beds. So, I know that one is pretty nutrient dense, and it's really easy to spread. The bags are not heavy to go and get and stuff like that. So I think it just depends on your needs. Depends on exactly what you need.
Can you put crushed vitamins in your soil?
I wouldn't recommend that because sometimes, because vitamins are not regulated by the FDA, some vitamin companies put things into the vitamins that we don't really need. And they could be additives that might not be a good thing to be in your soil. So it is better to fertilize your vegetable beds with an organic liquid fertilizer. One of the brands that I like is Fox Farm, and you can get that online. You can get it shipped to you in small bottles, and you mix it with water. And it's one of the best ways to really get good vegetables. I often had questions from the renters at the community garden as to why the vegetables for the pantry garden were so big. Why were they so beautiful? We harvested earlier, we harvested later. And I said, it's because we fertilize. So fertilizing your vegetable bed is actually quite important, especially if you feel like you have had just topsoil in a bed for a long time and haven't amended it. So amend it and fertilize this year. That would be my recommendation.
How do you secure the flavor for your rooted veggies?
It's a combination. The healthier your soil is and the more nutrients your soil has, the better tasting your vegetables are going to be, in combination with getting seeds for vegetables of strains and cultivars of vegetables that are very tasty. And so you would be able to tell that in the descriptions on the seed packet and in the catalogs. And heirloom vegetables, no matter what it is, heirloom vegetables taste better. I don't care what anybody else says. So look into heirloom vegetables maybe.
How do you know if your marigold variety is an old variety?
Well, it depends on how many years you've been collecting seed and taking care of it and, passing it along. For the most part, the heirloom varieties are marked heirloom varieties in seed catalogs. And there's only a few out there, and the Gem series is one of them. And if you're looking to fight the nematode problem, if you think you've ever had that or you want to prevent it, I really do recommend the Gem series.
So what can you do for squash beetles or fungus to avoid the following year?
So fungus would be soil sanitation. That would mean making sure that you are taking off the oldest leaves of your squash plant every week. Any yellowing leaves, any leaves that are dead on the soil, keep everything off the soil as much as possible, any dead material. And then for squash bugs, honestly, my volunteers and my crew and I would just go out there once a week and we would smush them. We would just smash them or knock them into a bucket of soapy water. Because we didn't want to use any chemicals. Although there was a master gardener that told me for about 20 years, she had been using just pure wood ash, only wood ash, no other ash mixed in, like pure wood ash from her fireplace. And she would put that in her squash beds. Now, this is like a real, anecdotal remedy. But she said that that wood ash mixed into her squash beds would change the pH so much in such a way that it was beneficial for the plants and it would keep the squash bugs off. And we did do it really purposefully one year. We put wood ash, we collected it from a lot of volunteers, and then we put it in all the beds that we were going to plant just squash in that year. And we didn't put a whole lot in. It was probably a half of a 5-gallon bucket in each bed. And then we did notice a decrease in squash bugs, and then we didn't do it the next year and we had an explosion in the population. So that's kind of a home remedy for the squash bugs, but it's something that you could maybe try.
Okay, we have a couple more compost related questions, so I'm going to combine them. So the first part is, does it matter if you add compost every year? And the second related question is, can you use sheep and goat manure?
Yes, you can use sheep and goat manure. I have heard that from other gardeners. As far as adding compost every year, I think you can. But at a certain point, if these are raised beds, you're going to want to have a soil test done. If it's been many, many years, have a soil test done to make sure that you still have all of the nutrients and the pH is balanced, because you may actually have to put some soil back in to get the minerals back into your bed. And so that was one of the problems that we had at our community garden and they're probably going to have to do it this year. Now that I've left the job, it's not my responsibility anymore, but what they're probably going to have to do this year, I can predict, is we're going to have to put black soil in the beds. It's time to renew that mineral resource. But again, you want to make sure that it's a good balance, more compost than soil.
Do you rotate your crops?
Yes, we did rotate our crops. I was really insistent on that. My partner, if he had the choice, he would just keep everything in one place because that's what he did at home. But I was pretty intent on making sure that most everything was rotated. So, and mostly for the squash. That was mostly for the squash because the squash bugs would overwinter as eggs in the soil of the beds.
Regarding raised beds, what is the preferred material? The person writing this has heard negative things about treated wood.
Cedar wood is recommended, and it will last you about 10 years if you treat it good. And another raised bed method that you can do is with galvanized steel water troughs. If you want to go that way, they last even longer. You poke holes in the bottom of them with like a pickaxe. It's real easy. Don't try to drill holes through galvanized steel. It doesn't work. do you see straight down this aisle where these beds are? Do you see those silver bins in the back? Those are horse troughs that were 2 foot wide by 6 feet long. And we were able to put vegetables in there for the senior center. So we would put like 3 tomato plants in one or 1 zucchini plant in one. And then the seniors could come out and gather it and take it inside for the other seniors. That is an option. That's how my brother vegetable gardens. And they're raised up. You can sit on a bucket. You're not stooping over. It's pretty easy. You can poke the holes. Again, you can poke the holes with a pickaxe. So that's an option too, if you just want to stay away from wood completely. But if you're going to go wood, go cedar wood. If you look in this picture up towards the top in the right, those are all of our renter beds, and those are all cedar. Now, all the beds in front of you are a composite timber that we just happen to have at our yard at the Park District. And we used those as the borders for the playgrounds for many, many decades. They had to stop though, because they couldn't get them anymore. They would come in from Canada and they couldn't get them anymore. And what they are is the composite of all of the plastic that is left over after you recycle a car. So they're absolutely indestructible. They were really hard to cut. They weighed about 100 pounds. They're 8 feet long. They were 100 pounds. So they're very, very heavy. So it's good for this application because, you know, no one's ever going to mess around with them. But I would go cedar wood or the steel.
Do you have any tricks for radishes and beets? For this person, the leaves grew, but the root never seemed to form a harvestable vegetable.
Well, have loose soil first. Make sure your soil is nice and loose and well draining, and then fertilize. And when I say fertilize, when I'm suggesting fertilizing, I'm suggesting that however many scoops or ounces or whatever they say to add to a watering can, put half in. Do it very diluted, very gentle. That is how I've always gotten the best results for flowers and for the vegetables here at the community garden.
Why do you use the bedding planting versus lined planting? What are the advantages versus disadvantages?
Do you mean using raised beds rather than rows in the ground? I'm assuming that's what you mean. For this community garden, I had to go with raised beds because it used to be a baseball field. And more than 50% of it was that sand and clay mix of the infield. And so there was no way we could grow vegetables in that. And we wanted the vegetable beds, especially for the pantry garden, to be friendly for our volunteers. So our volunteers can kneel on the sides of these beds or sit down if they need to, and to make it easier for them to work in them. So I hope that's what you meant.
And yes, that is what she meant.
Okay.
And we had a question again about that organic fertilizer, which I believe you said was the Fox Farm liquid fertilizer.
Yeah, Fox Farm. You know, but there's liquid fish emulsions out there that gardeners swear by. So liquid fish emulsion is good. That's an organic fertilizer. There's lots of different formulas of liquid fertilizers, liquid organic fertilizers. So I think that pretty much any one that you see online that has good recommendations would be okay.
And we thank all of you for coming, and very much thank Dolly for sharing her wisdom with us. We very much appreciate her being with us today.
Okay, have a great day, everybody. Thank you.